hard for me. Okay, you ready?
Yep.
Cool. You're gonna do great.
Well, you will too.
Bet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back from your lunch breaks. Hope you had a nice start of the day and a lot of good talks here so far. So good. I'm here with Alex Thissen, who is CTO at Xspirit, and he has a lot of experience. He's been coding since the 90s. He just showed me his Atari Lynx device, which he's building games for, and side right now, and try to teach us something about the stuff which is new in .NET 6. Is that right, Alex?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, as a kind of a surprise, it's also the stuff that will be coming in .NET 7 as well. So we're a little bit early preview 3, but I've put some stuff in the presentation about that as well.
Cool. I'm encouraging you attendees who's listening to be active in the chat. Ask a lot of questions. We're going to have at least 5 minutes at the end for questions, and I will try to moderate that for you. So ask any questions you have, and we will take them at the end. Otherwise, Alex, we're ready for you to take the stage.
All right, let's do that. I'll reorganize a couple of things.
Yeah. You go ahead. Just start when you're ready. Maybe I should have mentioned you're an MVP as well. 15 years running. That's cool. Yeah.
All right. Cool. So, Andres, can you confirm that?
Looks good. I can see your presentation. So just take it away.
All right. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Well, as introduced, I'm Alex Thissen. I'm from the Netherlands, presenting from my home office at the moment, and I want to take you through what is new in the ASP.NET Core 6 and a bit of 7 with minimal web APIs. And the agenda for today, I thought, okay, let's put up the canonical example of what a new minimal style web API would look like. And this is this seems all fairly simple and just 4 lines of code to get a web API and a web application running. But there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes, and we'll take a closer look and what is happening and what are the changes that have been introduced in this in .NET 7 and 6. Well, it didn't start straight away. The journey to get to minimal web APIs has been inspired by a couple of frameworks, and there's been one framework that is a bit older. It's also .NET based, and it's called NancyFX, the Nancy framework. And the idea was that you could use these modules to map your endpoints to an implementation with Lambda expressions. You can see it in the example there. It still requires a bit of plumbing because you can see that you need to define a class, you need to define a constructor, and inside of this constructor there's a lot of wiring up going on. But it was a start, and it's somewhat of what we will be seeing later on as well. Well, from other languages, F#, for example, you see that there's also efforts like in Giraffe to do the same, even in a functional language, between mapping endpoints to an expression that has the actual logic. And if we take a look outside of the .NET space, you will encounter, for example, Node.js that has Express. And Express is a framework that does, again, this very same thing. So you have these endpoints, you have delegates, and the delegates or Lambda expressions, they do the actual implementation. And it's just a matter of some constants, mapping, and then finally starting the application. So that's the 3-step process. And finally, if you go to Python, there's a framework Flask, and Flask does the same thing. It has these methods, it has some attributes or metadata that again do mapping of endpoints to implementation. And that's kind of the theme. And this was what was the inspiration for the ASP.NET Core team to figure out why can't we do this in our ASP.NET Core. We need a lot of plumbing to get things started. But you might wonder or ask yourself, is that really, really new? Because you could do a program that is only 2 lines of code to get this simple responding to an incoming request. And I've listed it here. But if you need to work with this, you're actually it's kind of rough and tough to build an application this way, because there's a lot of things missing. You need to interact with the request and response directly, and there's difficulties of doing anything useful other than just sending out a very basic response to the incoming request. And it's soon you find out that you have to do a lot of parsing, working with the data, and it's all at the request response level. So then came .NET 6, and .NET 6 is now the long-term support version, and the .NET 7 version is now in preview 3. As you can see, it's been out for about 2 weeks now. I will put a few things along the way into the presentation. You'll see what is the additional things in .NET 7, but in .NET 6, most of the stuff that we're talking about has been introduced there. So let's get into a bit of code, because that's what we're here for. So what I would like to show you is the old way first, just to get a bit of an understanding of what was in the old ASP.NET Core MVC applications or controller-based applications. And then we'll show you, we'll see what the minimal web APIs are about, and we'll have a quick analysis of what we're seeing there. So let me just get Visual Studio up. So first, application as you would have built it. And like it was said, I like video games. So most of my demos, they are not around customers and order placement, but it's about video games. And in this case, it's a leaderboard web API where you can register high scores. Now, the normal applications before .NET 6 would look like this. We would have a main method inside of our startup class, which could be any name, but the static void main was our entry point. And there we would do something with building the host, and building the host involved a number of steps. So it was configuration of the host, of the web host that does the actual web application part, and then you would run it. And the tricky thing, the special bit here was the use startup. And you could do this convention-based startup where you would say, okay, pick by convention a couple of methods in the startup class, and that would be the startup doing configuration of the host with all the registered services for dependency injection. There's a lot of things going on there. You would add things to work with controllers, and then finally you would configure the application, and the application would register some middleware and map endpoints to the controllers. And the controllers is where everything would happen. So leaderboard controller would be a controller derived from a controller base class. It would use some DTOs, for example, to implement a get method that we can see here. So in this case, let me get rid of this for a bit. We have a get method. We have attributes that describe how this web API will behave, and it uses some injected properties that are injected here in the constructor and kept in fields inside of the class of the controller. And then you would do your logic and do some querying on your database or whatever. And the database preparation, let's get that showing again. The database configuration would be up here somewhere, where you would say, okay, I have the database context and I'm using SQL Server. Well, I'm making an effort to explain all of this, because this is what was very common up until .NET 5 and ASP.NET Core 5. As you can see, there's a lot of things going on. We need to program, we need to start up, we need controller classes, we need to derive, we need to implement, we need to do metadata. So a lot of ceremony just to get to the gist of it. And this is actually what it's all about. This is what we want to do when there's an incoming request on the API that says API/leaderboard, because it takes the name of the controller here. That endpoint, it's all a bit vague, it's all a bit magic, but that's what we're waiting for. Now, if you enter .NET 6 and add a new project there, You still pick the ASP.NET Core Web API. You would name it something like your web application. And you would pick your framework. Well, you would have to pick 6 or 7 to do the latest one. This might be checked, use controllers, but that's not what we want to do. We want to uncheck it to use minimal APIs. And you could enable open API support and configure HTTPS. Those don't really matter. And if you do that, you end up with a minimal API that it has just a program CS. So not the controllers folder, not startup, just this single file. And it's a pretty short file. And as you can see, there's something at the very top. It just starts. There's no program. There's no main. It just starts with a bit of code.
Alex, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. We can't see VS Code. Now we can. Great.
Oh, all right. Very good. I hope you didn't miss too much. Anyway, I'll
just continue. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the thing is that you have this helper class, create builder, that creates a web application builder. You would configure some services. You do a build. And then finally, you do something like a map get, very short. And this is a bit of implementation. This is demo code that is provided by the Visual Studio project template. But you would replace this with something else. And finally, you would run your application. So just a couple of lines of code, and you would have your web API running. And that's what is there. But under the covers, a lot of things are happening. So let's get back to slides and see what is happening there. But first, it's important to understand what the big picture and the idea of minimal web APIs is. I think it might be confusing at first if you really look at what minimal web APIs is about. It's about new modern endpoints, a new way to define your endpoints in a concise manner. Not too much ceremony, no controller classes anymore, just some form to define route handlers. And route handlers are the things that add implementation to an endpoint. With the new stuff, it's also, so you can use old and new, you can even mix it together. So the old MVC and controller model still works. And you can even see that in the new version in .NET 7, that the MVC side is getting things that have been devised for minimal web APIs. So it grows there. And also new things that are created for MVC are also created for minimal web APIs. That's one side. The other side is that there's a new hosting model. It used to be a web host first, then came the generic host with ASP.NET Core 2.2, where they introduced a generic host to do hosting other than web applications, for example, background services. The hosted services, but the more came along, like gRPC, SignalR, and even WASM hosting for Blazor. So the generic host was a new thing, but it's still kind of confusing, how do you configure and where do you configure what? So that has sort of been merged together. And that was the idea, to make it simpler, to flatten everything out and get rid of a little bit of the history that has been created over the past couple of years.
Alex,
and also,
inspired
by the frameworks, they wanted to have more expressiveness. So easier to tell what to do. So it should be about convenience, not too much hassle. It should be about conventions. If you stick to certain formats, it will work. And conciseness is that you don't need that many lines of code to capture everything and surround it in classes or etc. And the losing the ceremony is mainly because of features that have been introduced in C# 9, 10, and 11. And first, I would like to just briefly mention those, because it will help understand what we're seeing in the code when we look at it. At the top, C# 9, the top level statements. That's what you saw in the code, that it just starts at the top. You have target type new expression, so that means that after new, you don't have to specify the type of your new and just do the parentheses and specify any property initializers. That's a way of leaving out, when it's totally obvious, what should be behind the new statement. It's kind of like var for variable declaration, sort of the same thing. Then in C# 10, there's some additions to creating this async main. And there's global using directives, so you don't have to specify each and every using directive. You can just do that from a global file that is auto-generated. And it's SDK-driven defaults, so you'll get a lot of the things that are obvious out of the box for free. And in C# 10, you could also apply attributes to lambda expressions. We'll get to that. And in C# 11, it's possible to do static abstract methods in interface declarations. And we'll also see that later on. But those are the things that make it much easier to use less code to tell more. And if you want to do that and run with the very latest bit, so if you want to do C# 11, you need to install Visual Studio 2022, the preview. So that's the latest version. Obviously, you need to do .NET 7, but you also need to set the language version to preview, enable preview features to true, and include a system runtime experimental package reference for NuGet packages, NuGet package that includes some of the stuff you'll be needing. So if this is all there, you can start doing what I will show you in a bit. Now, okay, getting under the covers. How would you host a .NET Core web application using ASP.NET Core? Well, we saw that there was a two-step process involved. There was creating a builder for the web application, and that's actually a web application builder object that you will get. You will use that to configure the generic host in general. So the generic host has configuration for being a host and how it's hosted. It does the logging, and it preps the dependency injection system that you get to use inside your implementation logic. And then if you do the web application builder and you do a build, you get the web application, which is about the hosting part. And that applies if you are building an ASP.NET Core application. You'll use a web host under the covers as well. So the generic web host will have a web host, and that's where you will host your web and HTTP workloads. There you will do all the ASP.NET Core things like middleware, application configuration, and most importantly, for web APIs, it's the endpoints and route handlers. So that's the part where minimal web APIs comes in. But the things that we are talking about apply to this entire picture. So using this builder, prepping a web application can also be done even if you're not running a web or HTTP workload, but you might just be running a background service, a hosted service, for example, or Blazor, or all the things that we saw before. Well, then, if we go to bootstrapping such a thing, we briefly discussed this, so just going through the steps again. First, you need to build the various hosts. If you have this web application builder, you will get access to a number of properties on the builder that relate to configuration. That's all the things where you would do configuration of the host and the web application. Your services, that's the dependency injection system. Logging, the environment you intend to run in. Usually that's development, staging, production. You've seen those pop by, obviously. And then there's the access to the host and the web host for the various parts of hosting that you are doing. And then the second step, after you have the web application, you will do what it takes to start up the application and configure it. And the important part is mapping, and fire off your application and do a run. Now, even deeper, if it's running, if you did all the preparations, you should have an ASP.NET Core application running. It exposes a couple of endpoints, HTTP based, might be HTTPS for secure transport. But by using the use methods, you are wiring up middleware. And the middleware is an interception pipeline to intercept the incoming request and massage it and put it to good use. You will also define the endpoints, and that's done by using map methods. So whenever you see map, you know that you're defining endpoints that point to a bit of endpoint logic. Hitting an endpoint means that the logic behind it is also being called. But there's work done getting from left to right. So whenever there's an incoming request, it's a certain HTTP verb, might be get, post, put, patch, delete, options, whatever. It's on a particular endpoint, a URI or URL. and it has a payload optionally, which is the body of the HTTP request. That enters the host, the web host, and the web host passes it on to the middleware pipeline, which selects the appropriate endpoint, because that's what the middleware is prepared for, and it populates all the information surrounding this request and passes it on to the endpoint, which dispatches it to your logic. Now, these endpoints they might be various sorts of endpoints, but for minimal web APIs, we'll usually define route endpoints. So there's a certain path that leads to the endpoint. The path can contain parameters. So there might be something like customer/ID, and ID might be a parameter for the particular ID that you want to get. And there's some precedents that you can configure as well. And then finally, you hit this endpoint, and that's a request delegate. And how that is implemented varies. We'll mostly be looking at the middleware and delegates and lambdas for minimal web APIs. But you can see there's a lot of other things like Razor Pages, SignalR that you could also use. So when we enter this pipeline, and this is important because otherwise it might be confusing of what actually happens. So we take this bare skeleton. If we do a bit create a builder, it prepares a little bit out of the box by default. That's the convention. So it has these middleware pieces for host filtering. And if your environment is development, it will also introduce this developer exception page. And then finally we do run, but there's nothing happening yet. The application builder doesn't do anything because the application builder is here. And we didn't actually give any instructions. We just said run. So we'll run. We will not do anything. But as soon as you start using the use methods, you will add middleware. And this is your area where you have influence. That's the application builder injecting these middleware pieces.
Alex, we can't see your VS Code again. Can you try resharing your screen or something?
I'm in the middle of slides. So
okay, sorry.
Slides?
No, we're seeing an old slide for some reason. Okay, carry on.
Okay.
We're seeing the one with the 3 boxes, the request handling in the ASP.NET Core.
Let me restart it. Can you see something now?
Now I'm seeing Visual Studio, and here we go. This is some code in a slide. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Thanks.
This is where we left off. We were just at the point where there's this endpoint that being defined, and what you see is that at the bottom here there's a bit of middleware that takes care of maintaining the administration for all the endpoints. And if you say use route, and important, this endpoint routing is needed because the endpoints that we'll define in minimal web APIs are done based on routing. So because you are using a mapped endpoint, you will get an endpoint middleware and the endpoint routing middleware without having to do anything for it. So that's the convenience. But if you use the old use routing, it actually means that you want to inject it at that stage in the pipeline where you have influence. And it still works. And the original one that we saw at the top first is not included anymore. So it's not a double endpoint routing that is done, but it does mean that you're influencing this. And also, if you have the old use endpoints, where you're defining endpoints by means of middleware, you even get a double endpoint middleware. And it works because the second one at the end essentially doesn't do anything anymore. It just helps building up the correct endpoint sources. But this means that there's a lot of things going on, and the use endpoints and use routing are actually not needed anymore. So you might better skip those if you are programming these new applications with minimal web APIs. So we did the middleware, and now we are off to endpoints that execute a request handler, that do the implementation. We looked at this code in controller actions that are in a separate class, that have metadata, and that return a particular result based on what is done in this action. This is the old way. custom middleware can do something in the middle. That is, you can define a lambda and you are aware of being part of a pipeline. So you pass along to the next piece of middleware, and you do something before that. But again, this is fairly limited in what you can do. And what we'll look at is the new way with mapping endpoints, providing lambdas that do the work, and another way of fixing all the things that we would be missing if we only had this simple method there. Because this is what we had before. We had this piece of code here, the endpoint map post, that has the route to a request delegate, and request delegate takes an async method with just one parameter for HTTP context, and you need to figure out how to do everything using just HTTP context. And a lot of things are exposed on the context, so you can get around with it, but it's fairly limited. And the other thing is that you need to use middleware inside a configure method, inside the start, inside of being called from the program main, and that's all vanishing now because we have this new overload. So there's now all of a sudden a new overload for map post, with a subtle difference that there's not a request delegate anymore, but a delegate. Just the most basic version of a delegate function pointer that is not specific at all, which gives us all the freedom, and it makes for magic happen. So the new API endpoints that we will be defining, programming minimal web APIs, uses map post, but not the one with request delegates, but with a delegate. And this delegate takes a number of does the implementation logic, and let's see. So this new overload is exposed on the I endpoint route builder, the same thing as in the middleware for use endpoints, but now it's exposed at the web application level. And web application is at the very root of our program CS file. So no more things surrounding it. We have the extra overload. We have the delegate type that takes an arbitrary number of input arguments. And we have a return type that is now iResult, and it uses a results factory to make it easier to return an actual implementation of iResult. And then finally, we have extension methods for metadata, which in the controller world would be done with attributes, and now we're doing it with these extension methods. Now, the good thing about why this is so important and why this makes minimal web API so good to use is that there's a lot of mapping magic going on. It's not just what meets the eye. If you look at this delegate here, there's a lot of things that are taking place. So first of all, we have the C#10 feature where you can specify attributes for Lambda expressions. So you can stick this authorize or allow anonymous, but it's also about endpoint summary. You can use new attributes and existing ones to tag this delegate and give it the metadata. The other thing is that there's dependency injection. So if you look at this high score repository, might be an abstraction for a repository pattern implementation, and specifying that means that in a smart way, there's a lookup. Do we know this from the dependency injection system? Yes, then we'll use it. And if you want to be explicit about it, you can set from services as an attribute in front of it, but you don't have to do that per se. You can even switch it off because normally if it's not there, it's looked up in the registrations for the I. If it's there, it's used. Now, dependency injection can be configured. I'll be brief here because it looks pretty much like the old ways, but you can still change your dependency injection factory. And then the other side of the mapping magic, going back to the same thing, is that you, if you put in special types, such as the claim principle or cancellation token, they are wired up automatically. And for example, if you want to get something from the body, if you put in stream or pipe reader as one of the arguments here, it will really be a wrapper around the content of your body. That's coming in .NET 7. And you can also use iForm file or form file collection to upload files, which is also new. And normally you would do the part at the bottom. You would get your data from query string, route data, the headers, or maybe the uploaded data. But whenever there's an object here that is not injected, it will be assumed to come from either of these. And you can still specify from body if you want to get it from the body explicitly, but otherwise it will come from the route data or the query string or your headers. If you want to get a little bit more control over this, you can use bind async, where you can specify your own logic of figuring out where data is coming from and how the conversion from HTTP request to something that you define. In this case, it would be high score, a specific type with a specific serialization format. You can do that. And if you want to do more control over the parsing, if it provides this method in bold, try parse with your input and the outcome of the result, then that will be used instead of trying to do default mappings. In C#11, it will be possible to define abstract static methods inside of the interface, making sure that a class, if it implements this interface, has these static abstract methods. And that would be the try parse or parse. If that's there, then it's an iParsable object that's coming in C#11, and that will formalize, I think, the way to do the parsing. All right. So let's have a quick look at dependency injection and binding. So we're going back to Visual Studio. I hope Visual Studio is visible now. What I've done is I've taken the old example that we saw before, and I migrated it to Min. The source code is available on GitHub. I'll share the link later on. And but this is what it starts to look like with the web application builder at the very start, and then starting to do all the configuration. So we're doing configuration of endpoints for Open API support. We have the registration of dependency injection, where we do something like a telemetry initializer as a singleton, where we specify application insights and add that as a registered types. So you see that this is all done based on the services, the logging, environments. That's what we saw at the very beginning, that the builder gives access to these things. So you don't have to do all the configure methods anymore, which was the old way that you would do in Program CS or Startup CS.
Sorry, Alex. Again, we can't see the code you're talking about. See if you can just restart the stream.
Now? I'll restart sharing. I'll start resharing.
Thank you very much.
Just a second.
Thanks. Sorry for the inconvenience.
So how about this?
Yeah, super. Thanks.
I guess you're seeing it, right?
Yep.
All right. So the things start moving to the builder. And finally, when you're done with all the preparations, you do the build, and then you start defining all your middleware. So middleware for Swagger, we have the mapped endpoints, which is where we want to go. And here you can do the delegates, where things like nickname and game are taken from the route. So in this case, it's route data that's being mapped. From the body, we're taking an integer that provides the points. And then here we have leaderboard context, which is dependency injection of your DB context. And with that, you have your logic. This is the same logic as in the controller type. This is a different implementation. But finally, we're returning an OK matched out. And we're ending up with the extension methods to describe what are the specifics of this web API method. So some Open API metadata, but also for content negotiation, what we accept, which types of data that are incoming for our integer. In this case, we did a lambda that's in here, so we can use these attributes inside of the lambda expression. But what you can also do is define a method that is at the root level again. So this is the get scores that is referred to here. This makes it sometimes a little bit more to see where this is the definition and this is the implementation. It also means that you can isolate this get scores to an external class. And then finally, newer stuff that you will see coming along is the iForm file, which is in .NET 7, where you can just upload this and store it in some format. We have the run, and then in C# 10, you can also define all these things like structs, record structs at the bottom of your file. So after run, this is like the point where the main entry point ends. Here you can do additional things like defining your types, which gives you a single program CS. The rest of this infrastructure and model is your typical application implementation with things for entity framework, and here's some model for the internal entities that are being used. Well, this is about it. So there's still a lot of things going on, but the most important parts are here, and it's getting less convoluted. All right. Let's go back to slides. We're almost there. Because if you want to do the migration, I've quickly shown you that if you are doing the work, meaning that you put in the effort to migrate everything, this slide will hopefully help you later on to see if I had things inside my startup configure services, where would that go? And it would go to, well, you can see that you would probably use the builder services or builder host to call the methods that you would use inside of configure services. So there's a little bit of a cheat sheet here to figure out which is going where. Now, I'll be brief here, but one of the things that you'll encounter is that there's a shift going on in ease of use. And one of the remarkable ones is in the configuration. In .NET 5 and previous, if you were building your configuration, sometimes you had to take this step in between, because if you need to read connection strings from a secure store, that's config, you would use the connection string to configure something else, and you need the connection string from the configuration before the final configuration is done. And this is how that would work. You would call the add for adding all of your configuration sources to the configuration builder, and you would keep calling those, add application insights, add key vault, and all the things that you would do. And then if you needed it in between, you needed to call build. And build would go through this step to produce the configuration root, which is the data that you can read, with all the providers for each of the sources, would be built, would be read, it would be loaded, and then the config data would appear as the configuration root, which is your iConfiguration entry point. And then you would use it, read it, and then start adding sources again. And then it would all happen again. You would add sources, but now with the secrets you just read from config, from the partial config, and then go through this again. Now it's flattened out. So there's only a configuration manager. It has a configuration builder where if you add a source, it gets added to a special list. But immediately it's added, it adds the provider for it and reads the config data. And it gives you the configuration straight away. So whenever you add something, you can start reading it immediately. And if you add more sources will be added. It immediately provides and gives you the config data. So it's much easier to read everything in between as long as you're just adding sources. That's the typical scenario. And when you call build on this one, it doesn't do anything because it's already done. All right. We talked about most of this. We're almost out of time, so I'll just mention a couple of things. You could cheat a little bit and add the mapped endpoints to your startup. The startup is inside of your configure, inside of the startup class, and you could use this endpoint route builder. You could just have it injected and start using it without using use endpoints as the middleware. So that's the quickest way to use API part. You can even use the startup class, and you might be tempted to do this, that you move it to the builder web host and then use startup, but you will get an exception if you do that. And instead, you should change it a little bit around to call it manually, but you will lose the convention-based startup. If you Google that, you will find out that it doesn't do all the magic with environments related to the names of the configure and configure services methods. I'll leave this for the demo. I mean, we are maybe a little bit good in time, and
we need time for some Q&A as well.
The web API tests. There's two forms of testing. One is using a web application factory, and the tricky part here is that under the hood, this program class is created for you automatically. So this contains all of your endpoints that are defined. And then if you configure your web host services, you can use something different than your SQL Server database and say, okay, I want to use in this test scenario an in-memory database. This is how you prep your scoped provider for Entity Framework. And it will start using this in-memory database instead of the SQL Server one. And then you can run your tests by creating a client and just getting or posting to the client directly and parsing the information and then checking the results. And another way of doing it is with you, again, prepare your in-memory version of the Entity Framework and prep it with some seed data, and then start calling methods that you have isolated. So this get scores, I isolated just a little bit to get it to contain this method, like so. And this is the isolated version with internal, so it isn't exposed to the outside, but the application has that exposed to the test API here. So this is your Unix project that can actually read the other thing. All right. I'm getting static now. I'll end the final slide. There's more stuff coming in ASP.NET 4.7. That should be good. And then finally, I hope that with all this, the theoretical part, that you get a better understanding of what a web application actually does if you're doing minimal web APIs, and that you have a better understanding of what you're looking at if you see this small example and know that there's much more to be had on the All right.
Can you hear me, Alex?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Oh, super. I'm not sure what's going on here, but we've had some technical issues. Great stuff. Thanks for the presentation. We had some questions about the slides. Is it possible for you to upload the slides so the attendees can access them?
Absolutely. I'll do that straight after the session.
Oh, super. We got a question in the Q&A tab for you. It's from a guy called Vilnius. In which scenarios would you prefer to use minimal APIs, and in which would you use the traditional approach? When to use which?
Yes. Well, one thing I skimmed over is that if it gets more larger in size, you would probably want to bundle things together and not put it in a single file, because you'll be scrolling back and forth, and you'll lose overview of what is going on. In the slides, there's mention of building extension methods to capture things that are functionally cohesive, put everything related to a particular business functionality together, and do the middleware, the services, and the routing, and the mapping of endpoints, put them together. If you use that model, then I would use this type in a lot of places, because it saves you from using all the controller-based things, with a small caveat. Some things can't be done yet. So it's not completely up to par with controllers just yet. There's a couple of things missing. Action filters is coming along, but you might find that it's limited in minimal web APIs at the moment. Anti-forgery support is coming along. So there's also limited support for form-based data that is being sent. It's just the uploading of files that is functional now. But remember, this focuses on web APIs, not necessarily on things that do HTML support. So that makes it a web application, not so much a web API. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I hope so too, and I hope that you can hear me now.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, great. We have no more questions in the Q&A tab, so I would like to thank you very much for this lovely presentation and for your time and
Thank
the
you.
answers to the question. Don't forget to upload the slides, and for the rest of you guys, have a nice break, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes for the next session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Andreas. Bye-bye.
Thank you too.